Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today we welcome the representative of our partner organization in Barcelona, Graduate School of Management in Barcelona, Professor Luis Razo Bravo. It is nice to restore our scientific dialogue after a 2-year hiatus. It is interesting to learn about the development of your theory, Luis. Well, let me represent you, Luis Razo Bravo. Luis is an entrepreneur and academic from Orange County, California, which is in the United States of America. He studied psychometrics as an undergraduate under Richard Harnstein at Harvard University and went on to earn a PhD in management from the Barcelona Graduate School of Management. His doctoral thesis on the physical foundations of effective leadership. He is visiting professor of management and economics at numerous European universities and director of EISM, an artificial intelligence consulting firm based in Barcelona and Madrid. He is devoted to stimulating dialogue among business, political, and academic leaders about the role of entrepreneurship and taxation in the formation of a just and sustainable societies. To that end, he's written 4 books, including the Definitive Management Book, A Brief and Intuitive Theory of Everything, and Competitive Cooperation. He is the host of A Theory of Everything, a YouTube channel through which he engages with leading academics and intellectuals from around the world about the scientific foundations of human flourishing. I'll briefly describe the format of our webinar. Can you hear me or any problem? No? Okay, everything is fine. We are talking about format. Luis will offer the first part of his presentation. This is expected to be 20 minutes. The audience will have an opportunity to ask follow-up questions. After that, Luis' presentation will continue. And after the second part, we'll move on to broader questions. So 20 minutes, 5 minutes, 20 minutes, and after that, we'll continue a broader question. Now I'm giving you floor, Luis, please. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Lidiana. It was a very nice introduction. I appreciate the welcome. The people of Ukraine and the students of Ukraine have a special place in my heart, well, because of our many years of relationship now. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about some of my work. So as Liliana mentioned, today's topic is going to be about physics, artificial intelligence, and competitive cooperation in international law. You may be a little bit surprised by the connection or the alleged connection between these topics. And so to eliminate some of that surprise is part of the purpose of today's program. Here's an outline of what I have in mind in terms of the topics. I'll first take up some foundational principles. These basic ideas, I think, are going to help us put the pieces of the puzzle together, because what I'm going to try to do for you today is put these links or these puzzle pieces together in a way that makes sense. And these foundational principles will help us get there. In the second phase, I'll talk about the connection between machine learning and law. Then we'll take a quick session for questions and answers. Then we'll come back and talk about competitive cooperation, which is the central idea or the central concept of today's talk. After that, we'll go on to physics and how physics is connected to these ideas. We'll go on to relevant research in other areas of academia, and then we'll conclude, and then we'll have time to talk again through questions and answers. Before I continue, I'd like to stress one idea, that the things that we're going to talk about are going to sound quite abstract or maybe philosophical to the extent of being philosophical. However, I want to stress that the core ideas here are physical and mathematical. They're not philosophical. Okay, so I want to make this clear from the beginning. I'll stress it again throughout. But as we're working through these ideas, please keep that in mind, because this is a different way to think about law and about our current situation as a species. Okay. Okay, so the first foundational principle has to do with the question what. When we typically think about questions related to law, they're most often questions about what should be done, what's right, what's fair, what's the right way to approach something. In this talk, we're going to raise the level of abstraction. We're not going to talk about what. The level of abstraction that we're going to talk about is who. It's a different level of abstraction, and for purposes of our talk, it's, I think, a more important level. I'll explain what I mean by this as we proceed. So the second foundational principle, again, very, very basic, is the concept that humans act. Okay, this is self-evidently true. And the level of abstraction that we're thinking about here is even above the idea or the question of whether or not humans act according to free will. That's a philosophical question that's not important for the purposes of this talk. It's on a lower level of abstraction. Okay, so it doesn't matter if humans have free will or not. From an empirical point of view, we know that humans act. Okay, foundational principle number 3 is related to number 2 in the sense that humans act differently. So there's different values that we can place on different acts. For example, to help one person is mathematically different than to help 10 persons or 20 or 100. Likewise, to harm one person is not the same as harming 10 persons or 100 persons. So the idea here is that humans act differently. And from a certain abstract mathematical sense, on the level we're thinking about, humans can be said to be the sum total of how much we have attracted and repelled others. I'd like to stress here that my argument is not that this is all humans are. This is only for purposes of our talk today, that humans are in a strict or in an abstract mathematical sense. We can think of ourselves as a sum total of how much we attract and repel others. Foundational principle number 4 is the concept of equilibrium. So it's sort of related to the previous slide in the sense that equilibrium between attraction and repulsion is something that's good, and it's something that's seen throughout all levels of nature, from biology and physics to chemistry, economics, and game theory, and many other areas. So this equilibrium is something that we can simply observe and comment on. Okay, so those are the foundational principles. They're very basic, but I think very important to help us sort through the coming complexity. Okay, let's go on now to the connection between machine learning and law. So what is machine learning? Well, machine learning is a branch of AI, or artificial intelligence, that focuses on building computer applications that learn from data and improve their accuracy over time without being programmed to do so. Okay, it's supposed to model the way humans learn to do things over time. So that's machine learning. And this is in contrast to traditional computer science, where a program receives inputs and based on those inputs gives results. The difference between machine learning and a traditional computer is that the program must be manually configured. The computer doesn't do it on its own. It requires a human programmer to give very specific and detailed instructions about what should be done. In contrast, the idea of machine learning came about in the middle of the last century by a computer scientist named Arthur Samuel, who began to ask himself, what if we could make a computer operate like a human? And his first key insight was, instead of having just inputs into a computer program, what about if we gave weights, assigned weights to those inputs? So if you have 3 inputs, they're not all equal inputs. Maybe the first input has a value of 1, the second input has a value of 2, the third input has a value of 3, for example. You feed these inputs and weights into the computer program to get results. And his next important idea was that, okay, so we can do this, we can put inputs and give each input a certain weight, pass them through a model, see what results, and then compare those results to some performance that we're interested in. So if I'm interested in classifying a series of pictures of cats versus dogs, I put those inputs and the weights into the model, check the results, and then compare them to reality, whether the machine was correct or not about its predictions. And then update the weights, go back, we circle back, we update the weights based on the performance of the model. So this, in essence, is what has evolved to modern machine learning. And the terminology has changed a little bit, but the essence of it remains the same. So machine learning is basically this. You have inputs or parameters, which are the weights of a different input. Inputs are fed into an architecture or a computer program or a model. This yields predictions that are then used in conjunction with the labels to determine a loss. A loss simply means it's a measure of how well the program has performed. That loss is then taken back to update the parameters, and you begin an iterative process of circling back through the model countless times until what emerges is a machine learning model. This is, in a nutshell, supervised machine learning. So machine learning, as I'm sure you all are all aware, has many applications in virtually every branch of human activity, from image recognition, speech recognition, translation, to medical diagnoses, etc. So I don't know of an area where machine learning is completely irrelevant. So it's really on the upsurge in terms of influence on the modern world. So the question arises, can we apply machine learning principles to law? And I'd like to take a moment here to differentiate between the machine learning that you can read about on the internet that is said to, or it's predicted that some of it will take away some of the work from lawyers, such as researching different cases or translating. So machine learning is said to threaten some of a lawyer's job. The kind of machine learning that we're going to apply here is on a different level. I'll explain what I mean by this in a moment, but remember, we're on a different level of abstraction here. So the question is, can we apply? If so, is the model in some sense, or the computer program, is it parallel to what we think of as law? And if so, the inputs are people. Can people be considered the inputs into what makes up a law? And the weights can in some sense be considered votes. So we have different people with different votes make up a law. And again, it doesn't matter here whether it's a democracy, a direct democracy, or a representative democracy. We're just thinking in very general terms. So people and votes make up the law, and the results from law, we can assume, are justice. Okay. So to answer this question, let's go back to our foundational principle number 2, and remember a mathematical statement that we made, that people act differently. So there is or they can be, in theory, it's very complex or perhaps impossible in practice to actually quantify this, but at least in abstract mathematical theory, we can quantify how much a person either attracts or repels, and this can vary from one person to another. We're not talking about value systems, because one value system might judge a person to be attractive, whereas in another value system, that same person or that same act might be repulsive. So this idea, if we apply it to the model that we saw previously of machine learning, we see that on the screen that people attract and repel. So this is a symbolic representation of that. Okay, so the question is, from a machine learning perspective, how many votes for each of these persons? We can try to experiment, for example, if we give each person, independent of their mathematical value, one vote. We run it through the law and we check the results. Okay? Those results we can then compare to what our goal is and run it back through and update the weights or parameters. Let's test it, for example, and give each plus person 10 votes and each minus person 1 vote. Let's run that through the model to check the results. Those results, we can use them to go back to the parameters and test again. Let's give 10 votes to all of the minuses and 1 vote to all of the pluses and run it back through the model. So if our goal is equilibrium between the pluses and the minuses, the question arises, what are the right parameters? And how do we measure people, right? If we can find an accurate or an acceptable way, scientifically speaking, to measure people correctly and to determine the parameters, then we have, in some sense, the basis for a machine learning model. Okay, so that takes us past the machine learning and law and how they might be connected. I'd like to pause now and allow you to ask any questions that you might have before we continue. Are there any questions?
Let me start.
Okay.
Just to clarify, what do you think? These programs, visual intellect, can be dangerous to the process of acceptance of norms, of judicial decisions, let's say. How dangerous it is? Because we, well, as a human beings actually, we have a brain, we have emotions, we have feelings, and we can produce sort of justify a decision. How about computer?
Okay, so if I understand correctly, you're asking about how dangerous it is to essentially manipulate our voting systems. Is that the correct question?
Yes.
That's a good question. Very good and very valid, extremely important question. Before we go into detail about that question, let me just say that at this moment, the argument is physical and mathematical. The level on which you've asked the question is very appropriate, very valid. It's a very good question. But for the moment, we're only dealing with machine learning and physics. We'll come back to this concept of danger or morality or philosophy, if you allow me, near the end. But for now, I'd like to stress how important it is, at least for purposes of this talk, to understand that so far we're only talking about computer science, and shortly we'll talk about physics. Later, we'll talk about implementation or danger or morality. But it's a good question. Okay, if there's no more questions, anybody have another question?
Yes, I have a question. My question is additional to Liliana's question. It's about correct using of this model, because if we speak about action under law, we understand that action which are qualified by law have physical part and have a mental part, the direction of intent. And really not always intent coincides with the action. And really how this model can evaluate actions and intent, and this is some correction maybe.
That's a great question. Another great question. It's a very, very good question. You're right that so far there is no differentiation between an act and an intent. Okay, so far what we've posited is just measuring what we experience physically. Okay, again, I'd like to work through the rest of the class and then come back to this question at the end. For now, let me just say that remember that we are not talking about the what or the how. We're talking about the who. If we get the who correct, this is the argument, that if we get the who correct, those questions about morality or how to tell the difference between intent and actuality will be much easier to resolve, because there is a correct person, or correct type of person to answer this question, and there is a less correct type of person to answer this question. Okay, so that's the main idea. We'll come back to this. I think it'll make sense shortly. Okay, any additional questions? Okay, well, let's continue then to the main idea of the class, or the main concept that brings these various disciplines together, and that's competitive cooperation. So traditionally, there is a tension between these two terms, between competition and cooperation. In fact, it's to say competitive cooperation is kind of oxymoronic, in the sense that you almost can't do one without the other, right? But in fact, this competition and cooperation, it mirrors a lot of the social and political tension that that humans have always dealt with since the beginning of time. Competition we might equate to individualism, and cooperation to collectivism, or between capitalism and socialism. So this tension is a very real and prominent tension that, to the present day, I argue, we don't really know how to reconcile. So the proposal is to reconcile them by bringing them together into one framework, one conceptual framework. And that framework is competing to see who's willing to cooperate the most. We'll talk about the benefits of the proposal now. So let's compete. So here's the proposal of competitive cooperation. Let's compete to see who's willing to cooperate the most, and reward the winners with more votes in the democratic process. So the question naturally arises, but how do you measure cooperation? So the answer to this is through voluntary taxes. And what's meant by voluntary taxes here is, in addition to the taxes that one is obligated to pay, one is allowed to pay additional taxation in exchange for more voting power. So the claim is that competing in this way will give society all of the benefits of competition and cooperation, while simultaneously protecting citizens from the dangerous excesses of either. So the claim is that this proposal balances in a very nice way the forces of collectivism and individualism and collectivism, or capitalism and socialism. So one immediate objection that comes up to the proposal is that, no, you can't do this because the rich will have an advantage. And the answer to this is that the proposal incorporates a proportionality by which a 20% voluntary tax contribution by Bill Gates is equal to a 20% voluntary tax contribution by a normal worker, okay? And that's 20% of the person's wealth. Okay, so this is how the rich do not have an advantage. The second objection is, yeah, but it's a lot easier for the rich to give. Bill Gates has a lot of extra money. The average person does not. So the answer to this is that it's an incomplete understanding of the proposal, because yes, rich people have a lot more money to give, but this liberty that they have is limited by the rate of return on capital. So the rate of return on capital is how much your money can make for you. Okay, so anything above the rate of return on capital, and this point here signaled by the arrow, anything above that rate of return on capital, a person begins to lose their wealth. You can't give more than the rate of return on capital without losing your own wealth and your own ability to make more money. And more importantly, at the highest levels of contribution, which presumably will be near 100% voluntary taxation, a person cannot give and remain wealthy. So essentially what the proposal does is to remove the influence of wealth from the political process. And it does so in the way that I just explained here, that a rich person cannot compete at the highest levels without becoming, or without driving herself into poverty. And if a person is willing to do that, the central idea here is that this is the kind of person that we need to have more decision-making power in the political process, in a democratic political process. Okay, so the question is, a key question arises. So what exactly is the right voting formula or algorithm? If Jeff Bezos gives 10%, for example, and the average person gives 12%, how many votes should Bezos get and how many votes should the average person get? Okay, so that brings us back to our previous question when we talked about machine learning. And if you remember in that slide, we talked about if our goal is equilibrium, the question is, how do we measure people and what are the right parameters? Okay, so this brings us to the physics, the physical foundations of the argument. And it's through physics and through the proposal for competitive cooperation that we'll understand the value of machine learning in this process. So previously we saw an example of one type of machine learning, which is called supervised machine learning. In supervised machine learning, you input data that is labeled. You have to first label the data. So if you want to classify pictures of dogs versus cats, before you input that data into the machine learning model, you have to physically label those pictures as dogs or cats in order for the machine model to work and be able to judge its outcome with the actual labels. In other words, to judge how correct or incorrect were its predictions. There's another type of machine learning, it's known as unsupervised machine learning, where a computer or a machine learning model simply ingests data and begins to sort that data. So if we used this concept of an unsupervised machine learning and input on a very abstract level all citizens or all politicians into the system, and here they are represented by the pluses and minuses, the machine learning model will sort. For example, one option is for the machine learning model to begin to cluster all the positives and cluster all of the negatives. And let me take a moment to remind you that the plus and the negative here are only mathematical. It's not a value statement. It's not the repulsive symbols here are not meant to be repulsive behavior because, again, this is a mathematical and physical argument. It's not a value judgment because one repulsive act for one person might be an attractive act for another person. Okay, so the danger here with this kind of clustering is that it doesn't really get us to what we are looking for. Because what we're looking for is not a clustering of all the positives and all the negatives, but rather an equilibrium between the two. Furthermore, there's danger in that this kind of clustering in some sense mirrors the kind of polarizing that we see in society today. And it's growing according to many, many different measures. And this polarizing, for example, is in politics, in social media, in economics. There's even arguments that on a biological level, there's some evidence for polarizing effects because people tend to marry into people like them. So this concept of assortative mating also has a polarizing effect. So in summary, this clustering of the machine learning model is not necessarily what we're looking for. It's one aspect of machine learning that has its uses in data science, but for our purposes, it's not as useful. Instead, what we want is that the concept of equilibrium, where there's no more polarization, where there's a balance between the attraction and repulsion in society. So the question arises, if we put this mathematical representation of citizens or politicians, if we feed it into an algorithm and our goal is for an output that is balanced, we're looking for an equilibrium. What is that algorithm that will lead us to that equilibrium? And that algorithm, surprisingly enough, are the Einstein field equations. Again, this is a mathematical and physical fact about how nature works at a very fundamental level. And this theory, as we all know, has been well tested and well established for over 100 years, and to a level of precision that's unprecedented. So this is a surprising finding, that an algorithm finally yields the Einstein field equations if what we want is a balance between attraction and repulsion. This shouldn't be, on second thought, it shouldn't be all that surprising, because attraction and repulsion, the forces are prevalent throughout all levels of nature, from the quantum physical level all the way through the cosmological level. And in fact, it's what has given rise to life as we know it today. In fact, Isaac Newton, at the beginning of the scientific revolution, in the preface to his master or most famous work, the Principia Mathematica, he wrote the following, and this is a paraphrase. He said, "I wish we could derive all of nature from mechanical principles. I suspect that they may all depend upon the forces of attraction and repulsion." This is when I first read this, I was surprised because it's rarely ever mentioned. And this is interesting because if you listen to the spirit of this opening statement, his work is so important to the development of modern science as we know it. And it's such a masterpiece of intellectual accomplishment. And he's basically saying here, this book is the best that I can do. I haven't been able to do more because I can't seem to grasp attraction and repulsion. So I don't think this is coincidental, because several centuries later, after some of the most amazing advances in science since then, from Einstein's general theory of relativity to quantum mechanics to computer science, we still don't understand what gravity and dark energy are. So what attraction and repulsion are. They remain the most mysterious forces to this day. So in this regard, the gravitational math is key, because what we're trying to do here is reach an equilibrium in international law and in society. So if the connections that I've made so far are relevant, then the gravitational math is part of the solution that we're looking for to answer the previous questions. So in nature, gravity depends on the mass of an object. So the sun has more mass than the earth, which is why the earth revolves around the sun, and why the sun is the key player in the solar system because of its mass. So in human interaction then, right, if we're going to make this connection between machine learning and physics, we need to ask the question, so okay, in human interaction, what is the equivalent of mass? What kind of person or persons should we revolve around? What kind of person or persons should be our leaders? So the answer, this is an empirical question that we can test. Okay. For example, should we make the tallest people, should we give them more voting power? Or maybe the most attractive people, right? Attractive people attract more. So maybe it makes sense to make the attractive people have more votes in the democratic process. How about the intelligent people? That seems to make sense. If you base your law on the most intelligent people, That seems on a certain level to make some sense. Test it. Or how about how much a person invests or is willing to invest in the common good of society? And this is where the proposal for voluntary taxes finds its place among these different options. I'm going to argue that voluntary taxes is the most logical and reasonable of them. But once again, it's an empirical question. It's not a moral or philosophical question. It's something that we can test and run through the physics and the math to see what works. For example, you can have two societies, one that gives all of the tallest people a lot more power, see what kind of laws they produce, one that gives all of the highly intelligent people more power, see what kind of society is produced or city is produced. And among these, we can make it so that the people who are most invested or the most committed to the common good have more voting power in the democratic process. And over time, the physics and the math will tell us which of those options is the most apt in terms of long-term survival. Okay, so we go back to the previous questions. How do we measure people, right? If these connections between machine learning and physics are valid, the key questions become, how do we measure people and what are the right parameters if our goal is equilibrium? So the first question, we just propose an answer through voluntary taxes. So that brings us to the second question. Okay, voluntary taxes, but what are the right parameters? What is the mathematical formula or the logarithm that we apply to the people who pay different levels of voluntary taxes? And again, here, the concept that emerges from our machine learning model, that in order to reach equilibrium between the positives and the negatives, the algorithm is gravity or the Einstein field equations. And at the heart of the Einstein field equations, or maybe gravity in general, is the inverse square law. And inverse square law exists whenever a measured physical quantity is inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the source of that physical quantity. Okay, that's a soup of words there, so let me explain it. So the inverse square law simply says that, as you see on the screen, if you see the S stands for source of light. As the light is beamed out, the farther away you move from that source, the less power has the light, okay? And the same applies for gravity. So the further away an object is from the sun, the less gravitational force is applied to that object. And the key mathematics here is the inverse square law. Okay, so again, the previous questions, how do we measure people? Through voluntary taxes. What are the right parameters? Our machine learning model tells us that the inverse square law is key if our goal is equilibrium. So what we want to do then is to compete and give more votes to people who invest more in society by assigning them more weight or more votes according to the inverse square law. And on the screen at the moment, you have an example of an exact constitutional amendment to do just that. So you have individuals shall be allowed to make voluntary financial contributions to government above and beyond the legally mandated minimum tax rates in exchange for additional voting power. To refrain from giving any person an unfair advantage in the setting of public policy, additional votes are to be allotted in proportion to the donating person's total lifetime wealth and income, and the final tally of voting power shall be calculated according to the inverse square law. I'd like to pause for a moment to remind you that the argument up until now has been physical and mathematical. So the proposal here is to use voluntary taxes as the measure to differentiate between people. However, it doesn't have to be this way. As people, as experimental scientists, we're free to test other possibilities. Maybe somebody wants to test the opposite. Maybe somebody wants to test how selfish a person is. For example, in the ideas and thinking of the Anglos or Northern Europeans, Adam Smith played a key role in his concept of, listen, if we are all selfish, we're all going to be better off. So if a person or a group really believe this more than what's being proposed here, then the physics and the math don't change. Simply introduce the concept that, okay, the more selfish a person is, the more power that person should have. Okay, so the physics and the math don't change. And you give more power to the most selfish people according to the inverse square law. Okay. So here is the algorithm that is being proposed, and that is where the W stands for the weight of an individual's vote. The A is the voluntary contributions to government, and you see the squared property here is what incorporates that gravitational physics that we've been talking about. So it may strike you as very complicated at first here, but it's actually quite simple. It's simply how much a person is willing to invest in society over the course of their lifetime. We'll talk about why that's important in the question and answer if you'd like. Okay, so the end result of the proposal is an equilibrium that results from competitive cooperation. So that unlike the polarizing forces that we've had to live with historically up until now, and even on a philosophical level, we haven't known of a way to reconcile collectivism and individualism. What results from what's being proposed here is this equilibrium between a voluntary collectivism at the center of a society or the center of a city or of a planet that is physically attracting the rest of society, and at the outskirts you have libertarianism or individualism. But now, in contrast to what we had before, which is two polarizing forces, you now have an equilibrium that in some sense mirrors the equilibrium that we find in nature through, for example, the planetary system or the gravitational physics in general. Okay, so we've touched on the physics, the physical foundations of the proposal, how it's connected to machine learning, and how our foundational principles kind of guide us into this ultimate proposal for competitive cooperation. Let's now talk about relevant research, because so far we've been talking about my own work and my own research, but no person is an island, and these ideas are part of a historical context that I think you'll find very interesting. And in my case, I think I find it fascinating. So there's literally too much research to cover in a short talk. So I will only cover just some sketch, some basic, some of the findings or some of the research that I know about. A physicist, theoretical physicist from the University of Minnesota, his name is Vitaly Vanchurin, a very nice guy. In fact, there's a conversation that I had with him on YouTube. If you look for Vitaly Vanchurin and Luis Razo Bravo, you'll find it. His work is very, very fascinating, and it's very well aligned with everything that we've talked about here, minus the competitive cooperation, of course. But his work proposes to see nature itself as a neural network. And what's most fascinating about his work is that he proposes that if we understand nature itself as a neural network, it reconciles the historical tension between two of the most mysterious branches of physics to date, which are quantum mechanics, which is the physics of large things, and quantum mechanics, the physics of very small things, and general relativity, the physics of very large things. So this is one of the biggest puzzles to date that even Einstein himself wasn't able to resolve, and nobody since has been able to resolve. He reconciles them through this idea that the universe is a neural network. Okay, on top of that, the gentleman on the screen, I don't know him, but he's published a very interesting paper in a couple of years ago on the Einstein field equations as neural networks. So again, in both cases, in both of these papers, you'll find tons of references and lots of very interesting information. In my own work, in a book called A Theory of Everything, A Brief and Intuitive Theory of Everything, I outline an argument for there existing asymmetry between the physical and mathematical structure of the universe, specifically in something that has emerged from string theory known as the de Sitter universe. You see pictured on the screen on the left. This DS universe is in this case, a graphical representation of how the universe itself is organized and how it processes information. If you see, there's a symmetry, a very rough cartoon-like symmetry between how that information appears in a DS universe and how animal brains are organized. And how the idea is that there's a parallel or a symmetry between how our brains process information and how the universe itself processes information. You'll recognize this as connected tangentially to Van Schuren's concept that the world is a neural network, because neural networks obviously are what govern primarily the human brain and how we think and process and learn. So on top of that, there's the work, very interesting work by several prominent researchers. One who has had a very important impact on my own thinking is named Yakir Aharonov, and he's an Israeli physicist whose ideas about the nature of reality are quite profound. He posits something known as the two-time interpretation of quantum mechanics, and what it says essentially is that what we experience as reality is caused not only by the past, by the Big Bang. That's only part of the picture. The past is only part of the picture. Another important part of the picture is the future. So the future has and the past come together to give us what we experience as reality in the present. We don't have time to go into great detail about this, only enough to say that this is very interesting because this is very, how should I say, it's uncanny, the connection between how Aharonov proposes about the nature of reality being forward and back propagated and how neural networks work. We haven't gone into the details of back propagation, but if you're interested, look it up. Back propagation is one of the central ideas in neural networks and machine learning. Apart from them, these people I've mentioned, there are a number of very prestigious organizations, among them the Blue Brain Project and the Berkeley Brain Initiative, who are working on very interesting sets of ideas that are not altogether unrelated from the things we've talked about today. So these are absolutely mainstream, well-established, well-accepted institutes and academics who are working on these very ideas. Another example is the IT from Qubit group at Stanford. They're working to unify quantum information theory and physics. So it's very exciting research that's being done around the world. Another, maybe just as interesting, fascinating line of research comes from a gentleman named Glenn Weil. He is an economist, a very prominent economist associated with the Yale, Princeton, and the University of Chicago. He's now a researcher for Microsoft. He recently published a book about an idea that's based on quadratic voting. So we don't have time to go into the details of his ideas, but you'll notice from the title that at the center of his idea is the quadratic math that we've been talking about today. And he's been able to demonstrate through work with other prominent statisticians and economists that the quadratic mathematics that we've talked about today is the only possible way to get to economic efficiency and efficiency in voting theory as well. So that brings us to the conclusion. Let me summarize what I've tried to get across in this talk today. So we've taken an unusual approach to law and international law, and we've tried to raise the level of abstraction to the level of who. And we've talked about physics and math and how they are related and how they might help us to answer the question of not what the law should be, but who should decide the law. And so far as you've been able to gather, the argument is quite abstract. It's very mathematical, very physical. It's not something that it's not a way that we're normally used to thinking about questions of law or morality. But it's nice in the sense that it gives us food for thought, and it gives us a different model of leadership that kind of sort of squares with common sense. And the proposal is that we should have leaders and we should be governed by the people who provide the most value. And the relationship between, or the mathematics that governs that leadership or selects that leadership is the quadratic math that is so prevalent in nature itself. Another, I think, very relevant point that I'd like to finish with is, even though the argument that I've offered so far is mathematical, or I've offered it as physics and math, it squares intuitively with something that the vast majority of people feel, that there is a difference between a Mother Teresa and an Adolf Hitler. So the central idea of today is that it doesn't make sense to allow an Adolf Hitler to have the same power or the same ability to determine what are the laws as it does to make or to give Mother Teresa more authority to determine what those laws are. So with that, I suppose I'll thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and I'll open the floor up for any questions.